Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm gonna rank the entire main series of Final Fantasy. As usual, I'm only covering the ones that got North American release. Thankfully, all of them did, but I'm not including the MMORPGs such as Final Fantasy 11 or 14 because I haven't played them and they're kind of like another type of games. And also I'm not including the spin-offs. There are many, way too many spin-offs, and between you and me, I tried at the beginning I was gonna do a complete list with all the spin-offs, but I found out that my opinion on like 90% of the spin-offs is, well, not very good. Most of them are like C tiers for me, so I didn't see much point. And just for the heck of it, I'll do this in proper order, like from Final Fantasy 1 to 15. Yeah. Anyway, so we're gonna start with the first one on the NES, the only one out of the 3 Nintendo games that was localized here, Final Fantasy, and I did play that version, and well, to be honest, back then I understand this game must have been a huge deal, but you know, back then I was barely alive, I was like 4 or 5 years old, and I didn't play the game, so until many years later. And when I finally did, I was like, considering I'm an NES guy, I mean I grew up with the NES and there are a lot of NES games that I really like and really enjoy, this just wasn't one of them. It's aged poorly. Thankfully it's been remade and remastered for a million consoles, and I guarantee most of them are better than the NES original game. So to me this is an okay game, I understand the importance. Let's just put this one on the C tier. So the first version that I played of this game, the first remake, or rather enhanced port, was on the Final Fantasy Origins bundle, which was the very first time we got a North American release or an official English release of the second game of Final Fantasy II, which was here. So this is the version that I'll be ranking because it's the version that I put more hours into it than all the other versions of these two games, which are usually bundled up together. So Final Fantasy Origins, my opinion, even though the first game still plays and looks better, much better than the NES version, my opinion remains the same. It's an okay game, and it's just one of those games that I'll just never finish because I have almost non-existent interest on it. And same with the second game. I played it. I think the first one is a little bit better, but the second one has more personality. Either way, these two first Final Fantasy games have always been rough, in my opinion, and for me, they're just not that fun to play anymore. C tier, both of them. Anyway, so moving on to Final Fantasy III. So this game came on the PSP and the Nintendo DS. Only the DS version is the only physical release we got. It is the first time we ever got this game outside of Japan, because the original Famicom version, we never got it. And I like the game. It's an okay game. Unfortunately, I wasn't a big fan of it. I think it's more enjoyable than the first two games, but the difference isn't just that much. So once again, this is a good game. It's an okay game for me. Graphically speaking, for its time and for the Nintendo DS, looks really good, but overall it's just another C tier for me. Let's move on to Final Fantasy IV. You know the story, it was localized as Final Fantasy II, whatever, you know that already. Final Fantasy IV, the versions that I played are the original Super Nintendo version and the PlayStation 1 version. That's the one that I play the most, the one that comes in Chronicles with Chrono Trigger. It's a very good game. It's very hard. Some areas are like very unbalanced, and sometimes the encounter rate in both versions can be devastating. And I think it's a very good story. I never beat this game, but the time I put into it, it was well worth it. So Final Fantasy IV, it's a B tier for me. This game is a B tier in my opinion. It's a very good game. It's just not excellent or a masterpiece. But that's just because I'm not one of the greatest fans of this game like some of you are. Final Fantasy V, I think it's probably the most underrated in the series, the one that most people don't talk about. All the attention is usually in the others. I think it's just as good. Story-wise, I don't think it's that good as Final Fantasy IV, but in everything else, it feels just as good. So in my opinion, Final Fantasy V, the first version, the first time we ever got this game was in Final Fantasy Anthology, and that's the version I played. This game, another B tier in my opinion. Final Fantasy VI, localized on the Super Nintendo's Final Fantasy III. The first time I played this game and finished it was on the PlayStation version. Anthology, once again. Then several years later I went to the Super Nintendo version, and it was just as great. I noticed the differences. I noticed the encounter rate was higher on the PlayStation version, but other than that, they play like very much the same. And you know, I'm a huge fan of this game. I love the story, I love the characters, I love the music. Final Fantasy VI is a masterpiece in my opinion. This goes straight to the S tier. Final Fantasy VII, everyone's favorite, the most popular of them all, the revolutionary title. I beat 2 times the original PlayStation version, and despite me calling this game overrated hundreds of times, I don't care, I love the game. Yeah, I just don't think it's a masterpiece. I just think this game gets way more love and praise than what it deserves, but that's just my opinion. I still think it's an excellent game. I'm gonna rank this little guy on the A tier, Final Fantasy VII. Moving on to Final Fantasy VIII. Well, it's recently become a huge black sheep in the family. A lot of people hate this game. It's like before, I don't remember people hating this game that much, but nowadays, yeah, it takes the cake for a lot of gamers, huh? Overall, I still believe it's a great game, and it's not as great as Final Fantasy VII, but I have a lot of nostalgia for this game. Jesus. God damn it, nostalgia wins. A tier for me. Final Fantasy IX is my absolute favorite Final Fantasy game of all time, and one of my personal top 5 favorite RPGs on the PlayStation. You guys know I'm a huge fan of it. You guys already know how much I love this game, how much it means to me, how it was the very first Final Fantasy game that I properly played and beat, and oh man. This game, along with Chrono Cross and some other games, are the reason I became such a huge RP gamer. Another masterpiece, another S tier for me. Moving on to Final Fantasy X. Another game that is really popular, really huge, and I have like a gazillion fans in this channel of this game, which is pretty cool. I've always respected their opinion. I think this is a very overrated game. It's no masterpiece in my opinion, but however, it's still pretty darn good. Final Fantasy X is a B tier in my opinion. Great game. The sequel I fucking hated, so D tier. Let's not waste any time talking about it. Final Fantasy XII. That's a very controversial game. A lot of people hate it, a lot of people loved it. Sure, when I first played this game, there were several parts when I was like really into it, like, oh man. And I remember I was like 21 years old and I was playing for like 4 or 5 hours straight. But then there were other times when I was like an hour into the game and I was like, I'm bored already. It's a huge grind fest, and I think it's one of those games that, because of the history, because of what happened with the original mastermind, which was Yasumi Matsuno, some areas felt weaker, some parts of the story felt stronger, and others felt like and you know, it has, in my opinion, the worst JRPG protagonist in history. So just because of those reasons, this game is no masterpiece. It can be an A tier for me. It goes straight to B tier. Final Fantasy XIII, I'm gonna rank the entire trilogy. I played the first game, I played the second game, I didn't even bother with the third game. I didn't give 2 shits about it because this game is just, it's not that bad, but it's, in my opinion, it's a very, very weak Final Fantasy game, and I can't believe it baffles me that they made an entire trilogy out of it. Either way, that's a D tier for me, just like the second game, and Lightning Returns, I don't even care. Last but not least, Grand Theft Fantasy, also known as Final Fantasy 15. I'll give you my opinion in a nutshell. As a Final Fantasy game, I think it's total trash. As a video game, as an open world RPG, I think it's a decent game. I never made it any far, I'm not interested in this game one bit. This is one RPG I'll never beat because I don't care about it. It's an okay game. Final Fantasy 15, C tier for me. So that's it, that's my ranking of the entire main Final Fantasy series, except Final Fantasy 11 and 14, which are MMORPGs that I haven't played. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!